It's been called the most important political visit in 3.5 decades. Chinese President Xi Jinping wrapped up his historic visit to the United States late last week. There was talk of beefing up cybersecurity, of committing to curbing carbon emissions, and of furthering economic cooperation. This despite the fact that the world's largest economy is not part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement signed earlier this week. Joining us now for more on the visit and how Canada factors in future dealings with China, we welcome in Washington, D.C., Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the China Power Project at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In New York, New York, Elizabeth Economy, the CV Starr Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, and with us here in studio, Alan Alexandrov, Director of Online Research and of the Global Summitry Project at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T. And it's great to have you three back on our program again. We do want to talk about this historic visit, Alan, but before we do, because the Trans-Pacific Partnership was announced just the other day, and it is such a big deal for Canada, I guess the first and obvious question is, since we're doing a program on China, and China, last I checked, is a Pacific nation, why aren't they part of it?
Well, if you look at the Big Four, only one of the Big Four is in, and that's Japan. Korea's not in, and Indonesia's not in. So China's not alone. I think some of the elements of the agreement, even as they were negotiating, were such that China felt this was not for it. It got more interested as things moved to conclusion. But, you know, I think we'll look to see in the future, there is an accession protocol. So countries can come in, and that's been designed, I think, purposely when countries see how the agreement works.
So, Elizabeth Economy, let me get your sense of why you think China took a pass this time, maybe not in the future, but certainly this time.
Well, I don't really think that China necessarily took a pass. I think it's really just nowhere near able to accede to this type of high-end trade agreement. This depends on, a high level of intellectual property rights protection, high-end labor, corporate governance, environmental standards. I think, in the best of circumstances, China's probably 5 to 7 years out from pursuing its economic reforms to a point where it could actually accede to such an agreement. So I think China initially thought that this was an effort by the United States to try to contain it. Now it's quite eager. Many of the people within the Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Finance, and other parts of the Chinese government are quite eager to develop a path forward to China, for China to accede. And in fact, to help China pursue its own economic reforms, to help push them forward. But really, the reason China didn't join was because it really couldn't.
I would just add that I think that actually the United States would very much like China to accede to this agreement, but only when it really is ready. And some of your viewers might recall that when China acceded to the World Trade Organization, and that was in early 2001, that was seen as an opportunity to accelerate the economic reforms taking place in China. So I think today some people inside and outside China view joining the TPP as an opportunity to push economic reforms. But I completely agree with Liz Economy that this is at least 5 to 7 years away. The Chinese just have a long way to go.
Okay, having said all that, let's put our focus now on the trip, Alan, that Xi Jinping took to North America to, in particular, see Barack Obama and speak at the United Nations. This has been described as the most important trip since 1979, I guess, when Deng Xiaoping came over. You're shaking your head already. You're not sure it was?
Well, I mean, it's an important visit. It's a state visit. This was Xi Jinping's first. But, I think one wants to look at this in a longer profile in which there are these leaders meeting on a more than occasional basis, that there be a series of these meetings. I think it's important for the leaders of the United States and China to get together, not just the ministers and so forth, which they do on an annual basis, and then there's some other meetings as well, but leaders themselves to try and deal with the tensions that build over time.
Elizabeth Economy, your view on whether this was the biggest deal in 3.5 decades?
No, I think that there was, an element of hype, frankly, surrounding this visit that was generated largely by the Chinese side. I was in Beijing just a few weeks prior to the visit, and there was an enormous amount of energy being put forward within the sort of the Chinese foreign policy community to try to think about how this visit could be as successful as the visit of Deng Xiaoping to the United States. But I think that was clearly not going to be the case. But they really wanted to promote this as a truly historic event for Xi Jinping's sort of reputation at home. Having said that, I do think it was an important visit. I think there were a lot of issues before the two countries, serious issues on, commercial cyber espionage, maritime security, the new draft NGO law that's quite restrictive. There's a lot of concern about that in the United States. So there were a number of pressing issues that needed to be discussed. So I do think this was an important moment, but certainly not an historic one in the sense that I think the Chinese were trying to make it out to be.
Bonnie Glaser, we'll dive deeper into some of those individual areas as we look forward, but for the moment, on your scale, a successful trip?
From the point of view of the United States, I would say that it at least met expectations and maybe in one or two areas very slightly exceeded them, but only in terms of oral commitments received from the Chinese. So, for example, in the area of cyber-enabled theft of trade secrets, where for the first time China's leader Xi Jinping did commit to not using cyber means to steal trade secrets for commercial gain in the future. Whether or not the behavior will change, of course, remains to be seen. From China's point of view, the most important measure of success was protocol and how this played back home in China. And even though on the front pages of American newspapers and, of course, other countries' newspapers and on their televisions, the Pope really got a lot of attention. I think most people in China didn't even know that the Pope was in Washington, D.C., having a state visit just before Xi Jinping arrived. And so I think that the Chinese and the U.S. just had different metrics for this visit. Neither was fully satisfied, but I think neither side was also was neither disappointed.
You know, Ellen, that's a good point. I'm not sure people in the United States even knew that Xi Jinping was there because the Pope literally sucked all the oxygen out of every room he went into. So in that respect, do you think the Chinese were disappointed because they clearly were not the #1 star in the U.S. that week?
No, but there was certainly play in the New York Times and elsewhere on his visit to the West Coast, his meeting with technology leaders and business. Those were some of the issues that the Chinese wanted to promote. And, very evidently, with the state visit dinner, you got to see the two presidents together. I think it satisfied Chinese requirements on protocol, and the Pope was the Pope.
And the Pope was the Pope. Elizabeth Economy, tell me this. Back in the days, of course, when Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon were having their landmark visits to China and just breaking such new ground, I gather officials would meet for weeks and weeks and weeks ahead of time so that they could get to know each other better, they could agree on agendas, and everybody could smile for the cameras when it was all said and done. Do you know if that kind of planning still goes into all of these heads of state meetings these days?
Certainly it does. I know for a fact that the agreement that was reached last November before the APEC meeting between Presidents Xi and Obama, so the climate part of that agreement took months of planning. And U.S. officials would joke about basically setting up camp in Beijing in order to sort of get the agreement ready to be signed, ready to be inked by November. So I think there's an enormous amount of energy that goes into planning these summits. That's not to say that you can't have some last-minute adjustments, and that may have been the case, for example, on the commercial cyber espionage agreement that Bonnie mentioned, where, in fact, I think National Security Advisor Susan Rice went to Beijing right before and said this issue of cyber espionage is an enormous one here. You're facing sanctions. The United States was talking about sanctions sanctioning China. And then all of a sudden, Meng Jianju came. He's a member of the Politburo in China. All of a sudden, he came to the United States, and a lot of flurry of activity around this issue. May be that that agreement came together at a very late stage, but I think in general there's really a significant amount of planning that goes in. And
Bonnie Glaser, let me do a follow-up on the whole cyberspace angle, because as I understand it, the Chinese have even been loath to admit that they even engage in industrial espionage or that kind of cyberspatial crime. And yet here they've not only admitted it, they have pledged to clean up their act on it. How seriously do you take their commitments?
Well, first let me say that the Chinese did not admit that they have engaged in cyber-enabled espionage for commercial gain. In fact, Xi Jinping repeated that China has not done this in the past and commits with the United States to not engage in this activity in the future. And so perhaps some people might say, well, if they don't admit what they've done in the past, why should we believe any commitments that they make going forward? And my personal view is that what really matters is behavior in the future. We can compare this, for example, to China's proliferation activity. And China years ago gave nuclear weapons designs to Pakistan and has never admitted doing that. But over a period of time, China came to embrace many of the non-proliferation norms in the international community, and what we care about is their behavior today. So I don't think that we need to get a public admission by Xi Jinping that the Chinese have stolen trade secrets from the United States. The real issue is what happens going forward, and I think it's going to be very difficult for the United States actually to convince the Chinese to stop engaging in this, in part because Xi Jinping has set out as a goal for his nation the rejuvenation of China. The Chinese are rather weak in their own innovation, and part of the way of getting ahead, I think, advancing China as a nation, is by stealing intellectual property. So I think, the jury is still out on what will happen. A mechanism has been set up at high levels between the U.S. and China to review this going forward. It will meet before December, and it will meet twice a year thereafter. And so we'll have to see whether, in fact, both nations are able to work this out.
Alan, how important do you think it is to the future of their relationship that China actually admit it has stolen in the past?
Well, if it were, we're going to have a real problem with the relationship. I don't anticipate that. I agree with Bonnie. I mean, it really is, what are we going to be able to secure or they are going to be able to secure going forward? And we'll just have to wait and see. It's very difficult to craft such an agreement. Both countries, of course, undertake cyber hacking for national security reasons, and the differentiation then becomes difficult.
Okay, let's move on to China and the environment. They have supposedly come up with some kind of understanding that China will create its own cap-and-trade system. What do you
make of that?
Yeah, what do you think all that's about?
Well, first of all, that's China's decision. The United States was not involved in it. I would say the appearance in the public of that discussion, the agreement for a national cap-and-trade system, was really long in the making for China. They've had pilot projects now in 7 different areas for a number of years. The original plan, I believe, for China was to commence potentially a national cap-and-trade system in 2020. This is being kind of hurried up with the 5th year economic plan getting ready, and we now hear the year 2017. It's very interesting because if you look at the pilot projects, and we have at the Munk School done that, you'll see that the pilot projects are really problematic. And so a national system, although it sounds phenomenal, may have some real difficulties to be put in place by the Chinese.
Elizabeth Economy, let me get you to follow up on that in this regard. I always thought cap-and-trade systems were supposed to be attempted in places which were pure capitalist market systems, not pure, but, generally speaking, capitalistic market systems like ours. China isn't quite like that. So can this work?
Well, I think, as Alan suggested, the pilot projects have already demonstrated a number of challenges, and China has only pledged to initiate a nationwide cap-and-trade system by 2017. That could simply mean trying to link together some of these pilot projects. I think this is going to be a long process in the making. But from the very beginning, there are issues with China's sort of efforts to do any kind of cap-and-trade, beginning with the monitoring and the ability of Chinese firms to cheat on the monitoring, the continuous monitoring, in terms of the transparency, in terms of the independence of the courts, and will the Chinese government, when it assigns its its commitment levels for each firm or each province, depending on how it does it, or by industry, is it going to play favorites among different firms? How are SOEs going to factor, state-owned enterprises going to factor into this? So it's a very complicated process, even in places like Europe and the United States, and it's almost impossible, frankly, for me to imagine that they can have a genuine cap-and-trade system, a functioning cap-and-trade system in China. The United States has worked with China since the late 1990s to develop a cap-and-trade system, tradable permit system for sulfur dioxide, and that still is not fully functioning in the country. So I think this is a little bit of the cart getting ahead of the horse when we're talking about this cap-and-trade system.
Bonnie Glaser, how about you? How seriously do you take this initiative?
Well, I think that the Chinese wanted to reassure the United States that they were very committed to the goals that they have set out, because the Obama administration wanted something in advance of the Paris conference this December. And so I think that the Chinese were really scrambling to come up with something. Perhaps on local, provincial levels, there might be some hope that the Chinese could do something like this cap-and-trade system successfully. But even there, I agree with Liz. I mean, I'm very skeptical. And on a national level, it's just hard to imagine, given the nature of China's system, that this could really work.
You know, Alan, there are doubters in every country. Canada has its climate change doubters. The United States in Congress obviously has its doubters. How do you think Mr. Xi handles the climate change doubters who live within his administration?
Well, I mean, I think there's a strong encouragement from the NDRC, which is their major planning, to proceed on it. There's a bit of a we call it an urban myth, you know, in one of the provincial areas where there was the pilot project. To tell you what the state of knowledge about it is, one of the utility managers received a certificate with respect to, you know, the CO2, and he thought it was a prize being offered from the government, and so put it up behind him in his office, because he thought that that was what was the intention of that particular certificate. So I think there's a lot of on the ground practical kinds of development that really needs to be forwarded. I would say that if he really wants to move ahead and there are problems, there's something called a carbon tax, which might indeed be a preferred strategy for China, but clearly the government's not prepared to do that at this point.
Well, as we all know, tax is a four-letter word, if you know what I mean. Okay, let's move on and talk about China and big business, because he did, Elizabeth Economy, he did have some interesting meetings with Mary Barra from General Motors. He met Tim Cook. He met Warren Buffett. These are, you know, they make for nice pictures in the newspaper and on television, but what of substance do you think emerges from these kinds of bilateral meetings that the Chinese premier has with these American business legends?
Well, I think, you know, from the American perspective, the objective is really twofold. You know, on the one hand, they want to make nice with President Xi Jinping because they want their companies to flourish in China, right? So they want to ensure market access, continued market access, and perhaps even some form of a favored treatment. So I think there's an element of, deference. He is, state leader of the second largest economy in the world. China is an enormously important market for most of the firms, not all, but most of the firms, CEOs with whom he met. On the other hand, I think there's also, increasing concern within the American business community about the state of the economic environment, about the state of the business environment in China. And so, continued problems on intellectual property theft. I mean, we're talking about, commercial cyber espionage, but we haven't even addressed, China hasn't even addressed its basic intellectual property theft problems. Again, issues of market access remain problematic for many U.S. firms. So I think that there are, a number of issues like indigenous innovation that the Chinese government has been pushing recently, new restrictions on banking and new restrictions on, for tech companies. There are a lot of concerns about whether or not China is going to be open, as open or more open in the future to U.S. business. So I think these are the kinds of issues that these CEOs are also raising.
Bonnie Glaser, as you read it, how enthusiastic do you think North American, and I guess American in particular, business leaders are these days about doing business in China?
Well, I think the business community is divided, and probably not just in North America, but probably all over the world. There are companies who are making good profits in China. Some of them are encountering problems and maybe even theft of intellectual property. But they've decided that the best way to deal with it is quietly through channels that they have in China, or to perhaps take a loss in one area while they continue to make profit overall or another area of the company. And then you have some businesses that just, I think, have been real targets of the intellectual property theft, or they're just not really doing very well in China because of the indigenous innovation regulations that have been put in place, the preferences that are given to national champions in China, for example. And so some of those are speaking out. Certainly some companies have gone to the Obama administration and complained about the theft of intellectual property. I would say 5 years ago, the number of companies, certainly in the United States, who were very, very high on their business in China, very optimistic, is far greater than it is today. The American business community is no longer an interest group, if you will, that is fighting on behalf of the U.S.-China relationship. There's a lot more criticism. And so individual companies are worried about themselves. As Liz said, yeah, they want to rub elbows with Xi Jinping, and they want to see if they can get some better deal on some particular sale they want to make or something like that. I'm sure Boeing was thrilled it sold 300 airplanes during Xi Jinping's visit. But overall, there are problems. The trend is really in the wrong direction.
The contrast is quite dramatic. If you think
what
about
and
it.
what?
Well, Tim Cook, Apple, a lot of their profitability comes from their sale of the iPhone, et cetera, in China. On the other hand, Mark Zuckerberg, who also met Facebook with Xi Jinping, no access, right?
No access meaning he didn't get to see him?
No access in terms of operating in China.
I see, okay. Yeah.
So, those are contrasts in the way that American business have approached or been able to advance in China.
Let's finish up with a bit of a spotlight on Mr. Xi himself and just see if we can learn a little bit more about him. I know he's had the job for a while, but having said that, I can remember when Mikhail Gorbachev came over to North America for the first time, and there was this incredible PR offensive. He got out of his limo at one point in New York. He started shaking hands with people in the streets of New York and Washington, and it was, it was an impressive PR offensive in order to get to know the, to give the impression of getting to know the American people better. Are there any pretensions, Elizabeth Economy, let me start with you on this. Are there any pretensions that China is interested in putting that kind of offensive together for its most important politician?
Well, I think to some extent they probably thought that they did with President Xi's speech in Seattle, where he made a number of cultural references to American culture, and he tried to appear very knowledgeable. So I think that they're trying to put a kinder, gentler face on President Xi. But I think it's quite difficult at this point in time. As you mentioned, he's already been in office as General Secretary now for 3 years and as President of the country for 2.5. And, a lot of what we've seen in terms of the domestic political situation, as Bonnie mentioned, the domestic economic situation, opportunities for U.S. business, now U.S. universities, American NGOs, everything seems to be trending in the wrong direction. So I think it's less about President Xi's ability to present a kinder, gentler face than to begin to take actions at home that suggest that he really does welcome increased engagement with Americans, because that's not the sense that's developing when you're, barring U.S. scholars who speak negatively of China from coming to the country, right, or developing a blacklist. So I think that these are challenges. A PR offensive, from my perspective at this point, won't do him much good. What really needs to change is the behavior at home.
Alan, we do have to acknowledge that when Gorbachev was doing his PR offensive, he was 20 years younger than the American president. He gave off a kind of youthful vigor that Ronald Reagan at the time maybe didn't give off. Let's say it. Barack Obama's a lot younger than Xi Jinping. I think, what, 5 or 6 or 7 years, something like that. Is it more difficult for Mr. Xi to be seen to be kind of hip and cool to the American public?
Well, as I think Liz pointed out, I mean, he did what they thought he could do, which was to give the various American idiom in his speech. But I don't see Xi Jinping that sort of fellow. Now that he's being president and some of the behavior he undertook, I must say, it's interesting. A couple of years ago, Xi Jinping went back to Muscatine, Iowa. I have colleagues there at the Stanley Foundation, because he had spent some time there when he was younger. And it was very warm and very friendly, in remembrances of his time in Muscatine, Iowa, and around. But, he's president now. He sees himself in quite a different kind of environment.
He's come a long way without my advice, but he should have gone to a Seahawks football game. That's my opinion on this. Anyway, can I thank our guest for joining us this evening on TVO, Bonnie Glaser from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., Elizabeth Economy from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, New York, Alan Alexandrov from the Munk School of Global Affairs here at the U of T. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.